I'm sick at the moment, so the quality of my content is probably going to be more embarrassing than it usually is. And what I'm going to say, I'm not going to sort of bother to properly collate in relation to the last two esoteric psychology compilations, which are, I think, are about 5 hours each. So if anyone is actually interested in the subject, it might be required for you to go back and sift through that mountain of sort of rambling and things like that. So I've sort of, in that, I've covered the same topic from multiple different angles, primarily on the importance of the ego. And this is primarily a response to some things that I've heard Sam Vaknin speak about. I do think it's very important to the differences between borderline personality disorder and narcissism, as when they are not comorbid and when they are distinct personality disorders. Those differences are very telling as to the fundamental structures um, of of the false ego complex, as I call it, which is or just the personality complex in total. And both borderline and narcissism have, let's say, problems with the ego, but they both relate to their problem to do with the ego quite differently. So I'm just going to try and touch on that topic, and also try to advise Sam Vaknin about how to develop an ego. Because he says, he describes, for example, that the true self, the underlying self, at least in his case of narcissism, has been completely, it has no operation anymore. It has no function within his cognition, essentially. It's all of his cognition can be explained and described without the assumption or the concept of the ego, and the ego has a very we're not using the word ego generically. We're using the word ego in terms of, or at least, and when I'm using that word, and when Sam Vaknin uses that word and I use that word, we basically mean the same thing, but I have a slightly different. I mean, my model is slightly more regimented. So, I mean, and I especially like to use the word ego in relation to the other sides of the mind, the subconscious and the unconscious side of the mind, which is where the narcissist is fundamentally sort of focused, whereas the borderline, I think, is also pretty much unconscious focused, but their unconscious mind is sort of in a flux to some degree. It's like it's a bank of data which is being channeled by a subconscious. Sorry, yes, no, I said the right thing. By the subconscious mask, and so effectively, the borderline personality disorder is a kind of persistent subconscious process which is relying on the bank of the unconscious beliefs in an inconsistent and even incoherent way, and they are constantly pushing the reset button on the mirage that they're projecting as their ego. So in some sense, the borderline personality disorder seems to exhibit a pseudo ego much more than the narcissist does. The narcissist is much less sophisticated, but also seems on some levels much more functional than the borderline. The borderline is, I think, fundamentally incapable in many ways of. Anyway, I mean, they both get into perhaps the same levels of dysfunction, perhaps, and spiraling, sort of dependence on narcissistic supply and stuff like that. I mean, I think in some sense, the narcissist needs narcissistic supply because they don't function with an ego. And so they need other people to be their ego, essentially. They are outsourcing that function. And essentially, the narcissistic supply is what creates the psychic unit, which they are the unconscious component thereof. So basically, I mean, the reason why I'm making this recording to some degree is because I want to deal with the topic of how to jumpstart or how to develop an ego. Because his description of not having one, or having one that was killed, or that eventually, because it wasn't used, it died. I mean, that's an explanation as to how one doesn't have an ego, but it's not an explanation as to why one doesn't redevelop one, or develop one to begin with if one never had one. You know, the idea that you had an ego but it atrophied and then you forgot about it is one thing, but stopping yourself from developing a new ego, I don't, because it's something that you do. It's just another. It's a meta activity. It's a meta behavior. It's a meta cognitive facility that one is actuating, and one is actively actuating. So it just is something that you have to do. It's essentially a pattern of behavior, and obviously, the thing that makes a narcissist, generally speaking, is that. Because let me functionally describe what the ego does from the point of view of not having one yet. The ego is just there essentially to regulate the subconscious. And because the ego will eventually regulate the subconscious, it will actually impose certain constraints on the unconscious. And essentially what a borderline and a narcissist doesn't want to do is they don't want to have any constraints on their unconscious side of the mind, or their unconscious data banks. They like that one-to-one clarity, that if they have this piece of information, then they can sort of know that, and because they communicate almost or the borderline personality disorder is also communicating unconscious content. What was I saying? I should have been saying unconscious. Hopefully I was saying unconscious. Essentially what the borderline personality disorder is doing is it's pretending to have their own ego, or it's at least pretending to orchestrate a certain atmospheric condition which infects other people. So it's like they're giving other people the atmosphere of so in the same way that a narcissist is trying to be somebody else's unconscious mind, a borderline is trying to be somebody else's subconscious mind. They're trying to be their emotional state. They're trying to essentially dictate other people's emotions. And because they know how to dictate other people's emotions, and they have to have some understanding of how to be able to control and manipulate other people's emotions. Narcissists do this as well, but I'm going to deal with that later. But they don't do it for the same rationale, and they don't do it from the same focus and intentionality, you could say. So in a sense, the kind of narcissistic supply that a borderline is extracting is complicity, or a kind of enforced sympathy, or a kind of reliable sympathy or codependence with their direction and narration of other people's emotional states. So essentially, they have, the borderline in some sense has a meta ego. So they already understand the ego. They just wouldn't want one, because that would make them the same as everyone else. That would make them a participant like everyone else, instead of the thing that's directing the participation from the top down, from the third person, from the disembodied sort of thing. So in some sense, they've got a mythologized ego which is being projected from the auspices of the subconscious control of the collective emotional feeling and the collective emotional mood, and this is all being orchestrated from the unconscious. So the unconscious is kind of thinking 2 steps ahead of having an ego. So the borderline is sort of 2 steps ahead of the ego, and they are doing it with the embrace of the subconscious. They are embracing the power of the subconscious, but they don't have their own subconscious. They kind of have a collective bandwagon subconscious that is shared between everyone in the room, that is shared within everyone that is connected to their sort of their network or something like that. Now, a narcissist can have that same kind of cold calculation and social manipulation, but they are doing it only for the gratification of the unconscious mind, whereas the borderline is actually invested in the subconscious component of the mechanism. They need to have, it's almost like the Borg. The borderline personality disorder is like the queen of the Borg. We are the collective. I am the collective. I am the Borg. And they are the voice of the condition, a universal objective condition that is just happening, and they are just reporting the fact, and other people just have to be complicit with acknowledging that. And so they kind of have a pseudo-narcissistic supply in that they need validation, they need agreement in that description of that narrative. Now, the narcissist is much more autistic in a sense, because or much more conservative, because they just need narcissistic supply just to know that their unconscious mind isn't an inert, inanimate thing. They need to be the unconscious component of drama and intrigue, or some kind of chain of events, so that they know that they are part of a living mind, because they are not the living component of the mind, they're just the unconscious bank, as it were. So the unconscious is one of the most important sides of the mind. It is, in my model, it is essentially almost the first component of the false ego complex, because you get, let's say, it's weird when Sam Vaknin talks about the true self, I almost think he's actually talking about the ego. He's talking about, well, when you're false. Yeah, okay, so let me get into that disagreement perhaps now, because it's slightly complicated. So in some sense, I think Sam Vaknin has a three. I mean, I originally also only had a 3 component model of the mind, that you had the unconscious, the subconscious, and the ego, which I actually used to call the superego. And then I just changed it to the ego, because the MBTI 4 sides of the mind jargon used the word ego, so I just changed my word for that. And then when I conceded that there was a 4th side of the mind, but that I still argue that it's not part of the false ego complex in a technical way, and that essentially it gets, when you have a false ego complex, the original self essentially becomes an environmental unconscious mind, side of the mind. So, and anyway, and I go into describing that. I'm not going to repeat all of that stuff, but basically, so you get the original self, which I don't think is the same as when Sam Vaknin says the true self, although perhaps it should be. And then when he talks about not having an ego or not having a true self, I think it's true that they don't have an ego, but I think that the ego is something different from the true self. Yeah, in some sense, you could argue that the ego becomes the inheritor of most of the capacity that the original self, let's say, devised when it uh, 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 grew the false ego complex. So many people that aren't narcissistic have false ego complexes. They have a personality style, and then they have this kind of completely lost original self or something like that. But I mean, talking about the original self might be a bit too complicated, because it has to do with very, very early development in terms of even before the development of language. It is almost involved in the development of a first language, and things like that. And I'm not going to get into that in this recording. But anyway, or at least the things that happen when you develop a first language become important features when the false ego complex properly begins, which I believe is generally between the ages of 3 and 5, is usually when you start developing an unconscious mind. Or perhaps even from the age of 2. No. I mean, probably, maybe anything north of 1 years old. Or or sort of 1.5, from 1.5 years old onwards, I think you might not have actually properly formed the unconscious mind, but you are doing things that are become, let's say, the organs which then coalesce into an unconscious mind, maybe even as early from the age of 2. Anyway, what's the point? Okay, so anyway, so you have an unconscious mind, you have this collected information and beliefs about things. You just have these itemized beliefs. Now, at some point, you have to sort of survey these beliefs, and you have to comprehensively inculcate them into meta beliefs about yourself and your motivation and your identity and your propensities, and you have to decide things about your own character. And when you make these meta beliefs about your character, they have lasting effects. They are like decisions which then have an umbrella of subsequent decisions. And some of those branches of those umbrellas and decisions are fundamentally incommensurate with one another. They are certain self-contradictions and things like that. And some of these contradictions can get baked into one's character. And usually they end up generating recurring subconscious drama, that you end up generating the same kind of emotional conflict, the same kind of emotional pattern, and sometimes that can be ameliorated by essentially finding a certain behavior that then you do incessantly, addiction type stuff. But I mean, perhaps other forms of, perhaps addiction maybe, but is sort of the wrong word, but you can just call it habits, habitual things and such. Anyway, what's the next? I don't want to get bogged down in too many things. And then essentially, having an unconscious will implicitly make you have a subconscious. And so the subconscious, the first time you have an emotion as a child, the first time you recognize your own emotion, you identify your own emotion, you characterize, you label your own emotion, you objectify your own emotion to some degree, that is how you start to build up a subconscious idea, it's a facility in the mind where you are self-reflecting on your own emotional state. So it's like you're taking a theme of your beliefs, of your meta beliefs, are being projected onto a bank of a new field called my emotional state, my mood, and how I know my own mood, how I can sense that I am in a mood, and how I experience my own mood and my own feelings. So having that is your subconscious, is being in connection to the idea that you're experiencing feelings and emotions. Now, what all the ego does is it says, okay, this mood is sourced from that belief. It's just merely basically being able to penetrate your feeling state, to see through it and see how it is being generated from an unconscious belief. I shouldn't really call it unconscious, but I mean a belief that is held in the unconscious mind, which is just, let's just say, a label, because the unconscious is something that you can be made conscious of. It's not by definition fundamentally always unconscious, but it's unconscious in the idea that it can be represented by an emotion or a mood. Okay, so when the ego is there effectively to decode emotions as their source code of belief or whatever. And then your ego is there essentially to be the hand that can intervene and can essentially work out which belief to prioritize, which belief to attend to, and which other belief to relegate. And then that might itself precipitate a feedback in your emotional subconscious. So your subconscious is kind of like a reservoir of all the leftover residue of unfinished emotional business or whatever. Now, in some sense, if you try to assuage your emotional state by just being drunk on your emotions and finding new emotions or something like that, that's kind of what the borderline personality disorder is doing. It's sort of like it's trying to outsource the function of the ego more directly than the narcissist is outsourcing the function of the ego. The narcissist is emulating the function of the ego by using other people through narcissistic supply. The borderline personality disorder is actually getting other people to do the reflective work of trying to attend to their unconscious beliefs and just presenting them as a descriptive narrative until someone cleans it up for them, until somebody else regulates it for them, essentially. And then they are very desperate when they can't find someone to effectively attend to it or something like that. But essentially, they can't be bothered to do it themselves because life wouldn't be worth living then, because then they're not moved by a form of sort of greed, by an immediate transactional power that they're going to gain in their bundle of descriptive mass that they are collecting in their unconscious mind, which they can always just rearrange and channel into a subconscious mirage to try to atmospherically induce other people to contend with their beliefs. So they're doing all of this almost, I almost want to say it's from the level of the superego. They're actually doing it from the original self to some degree, that they never committed to actually the false ego complex to begin with, because they knew it was all just a game that you were playing with yourself or something like that. And they said, well, let me just sort of simulate it to such a way in which I outsource all of the ego work so that I don't have any internal contradiction, because the false ego complex fundamentally has an internal contradiction that if it's actually properly balanced, it kind of negates itself, because the ego and the unconscious mind end up sort of balancing through the integration of the subconscious mind. And then if that is in such a harmonious balance, it actually starts to see, let's say, what's wrong with the matrix. It actually starts to uncover the environmental unconscious shadow, which is the original self that was essentially atrophied in order to create stable mental objects. Animism, or it's actually before animism. But it can be, it's interesting because there are many parts of the original self which essentially are distributed throughout the false ego complex. They're the kind of the introjectivity which Sam Vaknin describes of narcissists is a native quality to the original self, which then gets inherited by the unconscious side of the mind. As an example. Because of the power that belief has to impose a certain postulate and frame of reality, sort of the magic of controlling context. Okay, sorry, there was something that I went past that I wanted to comment on. So, no, let me try and think of it. It's important. This is not what I wanted to say, but basically, the ego is just another function. Is just the ego side of the mind is just something more to do. So it's just something that you add to what you're doing, and it ends up sort of changing the things that you're already doing because of that added function that you're operating from or also attending to, and then it ends up creating a more complicated thing. But yeah, so the I did want to make some sort of passing comments how the borderline effectively, it always annoys me more because I feel like the borderline knows that they're acting in bad faith. They know that they're shirking the work of self-regulation and accountability, and that they are outsourcing or exteriorizing responsibility for their own, um, that they're passing forward their descriptive mass, and it's just to allow them to sort of stay in that transactional, that pure transactional pursuit of power, because anything that happens just adds to their descriptive mass, which then they can use as an unending resource that they can always just narrate it at someone and then get them to sort of attend to the suggestive implication from that narrative tone of voice. I mean, the general description is, and you can get this from Scientology even, that you just need to look at your own life. You need to look at your own history, and you need to basically rewrite and recode your memories. But you have to comprehensively track your experiences and evaluate your past experiences in reference to the concept of self-ownership and self-regulation and responsibility, and and sort of okay, let me just explain that before moving on, because essentially you have to see the state of your character before you can sort of collect a character that has enough of a root that it can actually persist and be a consistent feature in your meta belief. So in some sense, the root of the ego is found in a certain meta belief in the unconscious mind that relegates its handling to something else that is metacogniting about it. And essentially that is the thing that has the capability of, so you almost have to, the unconscious mind has to almost take a leap of faith to some degree, in which it's saying that I don't believe that the subconscious should control me, but I believe that whatever, it almost has to make an agreement about itself to itself. The unconscious mind has to make this agreement that something should exist, that if it can completely control the subconscious mind, it deserves to be able to completely intervene and control over me. That is the kind of gauntlet that it has to sort of seed within itself to then create what then becomes the ego side of the mind. the things that I'm not describing. So it has to sort of have that open question, that open sort of quota or something like that, that if something is able to fulfill that quota, um, then the ego has a kind of latitude to develop. It has the space. It has, you have the open question in your mind in order to fill that field or populate that field with meta functioning that exists to regulate your emotional state, or to pervade and to supervise, um, and to essentially work out the patterns and the themes of what behavior and what outcomes of behavior lead to emotional states, so that you can effectively navigate your own life instead of looking for somebody else to navigate it, and to blame the lack of navigation on some outsourced exterior blame, sort of object that takes the burden of your responsibility and your blame, because blame is responsibility. If you can't take blame, you can't take responsibility. If you can't have blame, you can't have responsibility. And so this really starts by at least having a contemplative exercise where you are outlining the shape. You're simulating experiences, new experiences, by looking at old experiences and recoding the memory of how your lack of self-regulation, your lack of uh, being the cause of the consequences, or yeah, sorry, I'm not describing this cause thing that well. Yeah, but recoding your memories in the vogue of the self as cause, of the self-regulation and self-ownership as the cause of the course of the conduct, will hopefully, in a borderline personality case, will drive essentially the motivation to perpetrating that level of self-control, or because if you can define your experiences as being caused by you, and then you have negative outlook on those experiences, then perhaps you can motivate yourself to develop self-motivation. Um, but I mean, this is a personal decision. Because I mean, it is a different, completely mode of operating, where you don't have that transactional impetus that you're always just gaining descriptive mass no matter what happens, which means that you can always hope to leverage it against somebody else in the future, uh, as a resource in order to impel someone, um, to enforce your will, and enforce some level of compliance, or to deal with that description. But yeah, I mean, a lot of this is actually, I mean, in a borderline case, it's quite simple, because you could literally correct it through just behavior correction, through just, I mean, you have to abstractly understand exactly what is pathological in terms of the tone of linguistic use, the manner of speaking in a certain third person perspective. That you're in the descriptive valence, in the narrative valence, where there's always this jovial, perhaps, or sarcastic, or or descriptive. Okay, anyway, let me just think about this from a narcissistic point of view, because, yeah, in some sense, for the borderline, they really have the capacity. They just don't have the motivation. Uh, it's too perhaps addictive. It's too easy to do. It's another way. Um, uh, for the narcissists, let me think about that. I mean, for the narcissist, it's again perhaps an issue of security to some degree. I mean, you would think that the borderline would have more motivation to change because they're always complaining, they're always distraught, you know, they're always sort of fundamentally threatening suicide in order to compel people um, to enact their will. You know, there's always this tremendous either force of bribery or coercion or leveraging of social pressure or whatever convention or social permission from expectation and culture or whatever. You know, there's any kind of convoluted excuse or confabulated thing in order to provide a compulsion to their sort of to enforce their codependency. What was the point of me getting into that? Oh, you would think that then they have, because of all this negative emotion, that they would be interested in doing something else. But when they're actually confronted with the task of having to self-regulate, um, you know, I mean, they're even honest at describing their own sort of thinking about it. It's like they're not really motivated to do it. You know, they're not really interested. Um, they don't want to go about a different way. They want to be motivated to do it. They need a descriptive condition as to what they might expect. You know, which is kind of a paradox. You know, because essentially. Uh, because that's essentially the problem with their whole complex is that they don't own their own condition. Uh, they are in the possession of a description, and because of that description, that then they can report to other people, and that they can repeat, and that they can narrate at people, then they can sort of get a deterministic reaction that they might be able to expect based on all the rules that they have absorbed, even though that these rules are fundamentally relied on in an incoherent way or an inconsistent way. People don't follow them. They're not reliable, but that whole formulaic approach is is in some formulaic algorithmic sort of thing. It is pristine. It's solid. It's concrete. It never has to be altered. It's just literally you know, they developed the strategy at like 5 years old, and they just never did anything else, or 4 years old, or whatever. Um, or maybe 6 or 7. Uh, what's the point? Which is interesting because in some sense they have a because already the function of the ego is to metacognite and regulate the subconscious, but they have a meta ego that is meant to be a kind of, this is a weird analogy, but it's meant to sort of haunt the people that they infect with their subconscious condition, which is a kind of like a universal context which gets transposed and externalized and projected onto other people. Yeah, so there's a subconscious projection happening with the borderline. And then they have a meta ego that sort of that is connected to that transposed projection of the subconscious. Whereas the narcissist is projecting their unconscious mind. And onto other people, which in some clinical sense, when I say clinical, I mean that uh, uh, I mean that poetically. In a technical sense, transposing and projecting the unconscious mind onto other people um, seems more rational. It actually seems actually more normal, because essentially you're just telling other people beliefs. You're trying to say, no, 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 update your beliefs, refine your beliefs, like have these better, superior beliefs. And then those beliefs are sort of, because of how beliefs work, beliefs are itemized and they don't function very well unless they form part of comprehensive meta beliefs within the unconscious mind. And so the narcissist is manipulative in the sense that they can sort of drip feed the right item of belief, the right sort of in I mean, the borderline also does this, but they do this in a much less Machiavellian sort of way. They do it in a way in order to just sort of derail and sort of traumatize or barrage and confuse and convolute and disorientate people to the level at which that they will be hypnotized and seduced by the subconscious transposition. So essentially, the borderline is actively trying to demoralize people in order that they will be infected by their projection of their mood onto them. Uh, Projection of the so that you will feel how they want you to feel. You'll become what's the word that means, like a willing recipient of of that transposition, of that projection. Um, and then they can be secure in their codependent thing that they are the subconscious and you're going to be the ego that attends to their feeling states. So essentially that's why they are just always talking about their fleeting emotions and their fleeting thoughts, because they just want someone to absorb all of it and to collate it for them and to sort of sort it out for them, and attend to their underlying constraints, which they're not interested in attending to. And because you'll often find that they have desires which are fundamentally incommensurate. They're self-contradictory. They they definitionally they are exclusive. They're mutually exclusive to one another. They it's interesting because there's also a political analogy to this in terms of identity politics, but I'm not going to go into that. Um, the narcissist is trying to selectively import parts of their unconscious mind, and perhaps they even have a model of an unconscious mind which is not their unconscious mind, but it's a model of their, let's say, of their peon, of their useful sort of slave, perhaps, or their and perhaps I'm just talking too much like conjecture, but they are trying to change the people that they are in connection with, or modulate them or adapt them to a degree which just, I mean, isn't I guess they don't have a fixed sort of need. I guess maybe they just need to sort of prove the concept that they can prove that their unconscious structures are dominant and superior in some way, or have some kind of that reinforce their own meta belief about what something about the characteristic of their unconscious structure. And so they just need complements, or they need some kind of external reification of the prowess or the power or the utility or something like that, or they need some kind of validation of their, they need an external representation of the missing internal validation, which they can't generate for themselves, because an unconscious mind is fundamentally inert without it being actuated. So they need other people perhaps to actuate elements of their unconscious mind to prove their concept, to prove their belief structure is cogent or something like that, or is uh, um, sort of to prove the concept, or okay, I'm not finding the exact word, but so they are merely just trying to use everyone else as a kind, and the world at large as a general experiment to validate their unconscious structure, and also perhaps to prove that if they did develop an ego, that it would be an absolutely amazing ego, that it would be the only consistent ego, or something like that. Or perhaps they even have a belief that the ego is fundamentally pathological because it admits to a certain level of vulnerability and susceptibility, which is something that is the particular identity meta belief about what the narcissist is doing, according to themselves, is can't permit that susceptibility, or something like that. It might just be an aversion to susceptibility, but even as they have an aversion to susceptibility, I don't think all their projection is reactive and defensive in that sense. I think they get bored, and they want to show the power latent within their superior configuration, or something like that. Well, I guess perhaps that's only actually the more cerebral narcissist, maybe the somatic narcissist. No, again, I think the somatic narcissist is also trying to uh, externally represent the value that they innately possess, or something like that. Um, Not value, but uh, virtue, or anyway, so some positive thing, some pride. Um, some pride and some capacity, because it doesn't have an ability, it only has a capacity. And then essentially they need other people to show them, to model for them their innate capacity by affecting something that implicitly like shows an outline of what their abilities would be if they were actually playing the game, if they were actually vulnerable. So they're sort of creating a pseudo domain in which to sort of experiment and test and sort of display their latent capacity, which can never actually directly be engaged, or something like that. So the narcissist is much more fortified in the unconscious mind, and they don't even, I think, have. I mean, their subconscious state is fundamentally. I don't know if they even look at it. It's sort of the only thing that they experience is the anger, is the rage, and essentially, the rage is primarily a core. The propensity for narcissistic rage, or at least yeah, their propensity, not actually, because I mean, I understand perhaps some narcissists might, I don't know how often they might, or how seldom they might experience narcissistic rage, if it's an ongoing daily sort of thing, or if it can go months without experience, or something like that. But the propensity for narcissistic rage is precisely the lack of an ego. And this is what I wanted to bring up. Finally, I remembered it, and now this is the right place to talk about it. Using the archetype, or the biblical archetypes, the descriptions of the sides of the mind, the great whore of Babylon being the unconscious, an archetype of one of the two figures in the unconscious mind, and the rich kings and the merchants which fornicate with the whore of Babylon and are drunk They are drunk not on the fornication, they are drunk on the wrath, the anger that they get from fornicating with the whore. Now, if anger, if wrath is your alcohol, is your sedative, right? If you are sedated by your rage, by your anger, if you are drunk on it and you're addicted to it, that shows that you are connected with the unconscious mind. That shows, yeah, that's something that I didn't, when I was talking about that archetypal description between the subconscious, which is symbolized by the kings and the rich merchants, which are the effigies of value in the world and commerce and how things function according to the world, how the emotional state represents the underlying value or whatever, and then they are drunk on the wrath that they get from fornicating and associating with the whore of Babylon. So the whore of Babylon is the hollowness of the unconscious mind, which is fundamentally. Okay, and I'm not going to go into all of this again, but I what I almost wanted to make a recording just to add this note about it, is that the only thing that can quench the bottom line anger in the subconscious is an ego. Because the ego will actually do something about it. Because that's the thing that the subconscious can't do. The subconscious has these emotional feelings and things like that. And you can have all these different feelings, and it can tell you lots of things about your own beliefs, and you can come up with new beliefs that might deal with some of your feelings and things like that. Or sort out your beliefs and delete some of them and say some of these beliefs are outdated or wrong or incommensurate with other beliefs, and that's what's creating my feeling of confusion and funk or whatever. You can have all these different beliefs that are generated from your belief, all these different emotions that are generated from your sets of beliefs. And so you can curate those beliefs, you can regulate them in order to have more simple emotions, more clearly defined emotions. But at the end of the day, at some point, there's an emotion which doesn't get executed by mere beliefs, and that is anger. Anger requires action, it requires something to be done about it. And there's a meta anger, potentially, you could call it that, or there's a latent anger in just the state of having emotions. There's a pretextual anger, something that even the unconscious mind knows, is that, well, what do I do about that emotion? That emotion is my anathema. It's, well, if I say that I have emotions, if I believe that I should have emotions, you can try to have this thing between the unconscious mind and the emotional mind, but the only thing that you're going to be left with at some point is, how do you execute anger? How do you expend it? How do you exhaust it? And the only way to actually execute anger, which, I mean, for some people it might not be anger, it might be something else, but no. Anyway, what's the point? Is that and this is the magic of the ego. The ego tells you what you have done, and the ego is a meta reference to the things that you have done. It tells you, I have accomplished this, I have done X, Y, Z. Now, you can believe that you have done X, Y, and Z, but it's not the same as referencing having done it. So that it's a different valence of reference. It's a different facility. Like, you can believe that you have a history, you can believe that you have experiences and memories, but that's different from the ego's consideration of the same thing. So the ego and the unconscious mind are like, have quite a large series of intersection, like a Venn diagram. They're not the same thing. They are largely overlapping each other. Um, very largely overlapping each other. And the way that they integrate that overlap is essentially by fighting over the subconscious, or at least because they both have. Anyway. And so the ego can do illegitimate things. For example, if the ego doesn't want to feel certain things, it can almost in bad faith, it can abgonate. What's the word? Abgonate. Fuck, I can't speak with my nose. My sinuses are blocked. Abgonation. Abgonate. Anyway, I can't say it. The self-abnegation of the unconscious belief in order to manufacture feeling emotional states. So you can occlude your unconscious mind. You can chop and change your beliefs for your convenience of feeling certain things. I mean, and the ego can also do this completely freely in a way that doesn't create insanity or internal incoherence, because you could just pretend, and this is essentially what people are doing much of the time, is they are trying to create, let's say, an island holiday in their subconscious mind. They're on like a feeling holiday where they are numbing themselves by encapsulating themselves in an insulated experience. This is what play is in children. They are creating a time and a space that is secluded and disconnected, and that they can create and play and imagine things, but it begins and it ends. So, I mean, there's nothing stopping people from doing that, and it can even give them, let's say, some space. It can be quite healthy because it can give you a kind of a contrast as to what it is that you are actually experiencing, and you can sort of more easily identify things. But I guess so. I mean, it's interesting because there are everything that is done pathologically also perhaps has a correlating thing that the ego could do if it was just more responsible and more consciously, trying to work with all the sides of the mind instead of working in a kind of backhanded, bad faith kind of self-deception, sort of running away from things, why is I talking about this? So I'm just talking about all these different issues to do with the functions of these sides of the mind relative to one another. And what was I just talking about before then? I was talking about the Venn diagram, oh yeah. So I mean, the reason I was talking about that is because essentially, in some sense, the unconscious mind and the ego have a certain level of duplication of similar data, but it's not the same data. But it should ideally be in alignment, and the ego can essentially seek to, through bad faith mechanisms, try to subjugate the unconscious mind by fragmenting it, by disparaging it, by occluding parts of it, by negating parts of it, by sort of cutting it up, sort of creating a Frankenstein monster. And then that's not a good foundation, because it's sort of, that eventually will end up creating fractures and splits in the subconscious, which then will have a knock-on effect on the ego being probably in a state of dissolution. So the ego is downstream of the unconscious mind, and so it can, in the short term, it can try to create an unsustainable, sort of high, but in the long term, it will all just unravel essentially, and it will be downstream of that. So there's a lot of potential shenanigans of an irresponsible ego. Um, and in some sense, the irresponsibility of the ego will have to do with idolizing the subconscious to an unhealthy degree. The subconscious will be prioritized over the ego function itself. That the function of the ego side of the mind will be completely subjugated or relegated or subservient to just facilitating an optimized subconscious. Now, the borderline is way more sophisticated than that, because the borderline is actually taking the subconscious and it's perpetrating it as an atmospheric condition. It's not even their subconscious. It is a subconscious that belongs to everyone in the room. It's projected onto other people, it's transposed, it's interjected, they are disorientated until they're willing to accept that as their subconscious, sort of quota or their subconscious component. They need people that are compatible with adopting their subconscious, so that they are vulnerable to their unconscious confabulation and confusion and erratic, sort of barrage of mismatching, data, which gets selectively sort of barraged at them in order to suggest that they emulate or take on the subconscious, program that is being played on the airways, so they are like a radio. And so it's like, you're listening to these songs and you're listening to the radio presenter in between the songs, and the radio presenter, is just trying to sound, like he's just trying to keep up a kind of jovial conversation, and he's just trying to, make people think pleasant thoughts about their experience listening to the radio. But it's like, this is a slightly different radio presenter, because he's trying to make it pleasant enough that you will endure and sit through and listen to the things, but there are like coded, suggested messages in between the songs. He's not just speaking benignly. He's sort of suggesting things. He's implying things. He's not making clear and obvious jokes. He's subversively trying to sort of disorientate the listener, trying to make the listener get emotionally dependent and codependent and vulnerable or attached, trying to create, let's say, an attachment based on exploiting some need or want or desire or something like that, some sort of idea of complicity. It's interesting because borderlines don't even preserve the basis of their own codependency. They will try to lure someone in, and then after they've attached themselves, they don't even maintain the mechanism of attachment, because they I mean, I would explain that further, but because I described it recently, but in text, but now I can't remember it exactly, and it just ends up reinforcing the general description of the kind of behavior that they exhibit. It's not important. Okay, so in some sense, I think that the borderline is much closer to being able to develop the ego function. And the narcissist, what is their position? So yeah, the narcissist essentially is just afraid of the subconscious fundamentally. And they can only, let's say, experience that most existential, implicit correlate. Because you see, if you have an unconscious mind, you automatically are going to produce some level of subconscious, because the subconscious is effectively just the subtext of the unconscious. There are some themes of how the beliefs, the banks of and the sets of the beliefs, the thematic correlations that are produced by those banks and sets of beliefs. Those themes are going to produce some emotional impression, and even as you might be immune to experiencing the dissonance, the different degrees and the different subtle levels of emotional complexity, even as you can't experience those, the one thing that you won't be able to experience is the rage and the anger, which is that essentially, what are you doing? Is the sort of is the greatest subtextual question there is. What have you done? What is it that you have done? And that is an existential, is a fundamental sort of angsty kind of question, which the narcissists probably prize themselves on being invulnerable to some degree, or tries to fight it off, and then at some point they experience this sharp outrage, because if their whole structure isn't validated or externally not validated, but if it's not reinforced or sort of or proven correct, if evidence to the contrary that undermines their structure appears, that is then that makes them vulnerable to the existential anger, as it were. Yeah, so let me think, because that is a bit of a conundrum. I'm just trying to think what would the first step of that be in order to essentially have a subconscious to then precipitate an ego from the subconscious. Because you have to start getting more nuanced emotional states to start to metacognite about emotional states, and then work out a different interface of relating to your unconscious mind. So, I mean, in some sense, you have to work out a meta belief that is capable of relegating importance and significance to being sensitive and being aware, and experiencing more nuanced emotional states. And that is, I mean, I did actually describe this in one of my other things, talking about that Sam Vaknin even describes that the feeling body of a narcissist is in complete disarray. It's just completely fragmented. It's shrapnel and things like that. But that is what you do at the start. You don't have to know all the shrapnel. You don't have to, it's not like you have to find every single piece and glue it back together again. You just have to find a piece of shrapnel and know what it is, and then you have one more thing in your subconscious. And the more fragments of a subconscious that you track with, that you monitor, that you evaluate, that you check up on, that you conceptually relate to, the more it will sort of outline, like a puzzle piece, what pieces fit adjacent to it. And you might just need a certain constellation of certain basic fragments, to start generating some nuance in your emotional. And obviously, the emotional impression that you get from that is going to be like largely unknown to yourself. It's going to be like a child. I mean, I'm sort of imagining this to some degree, like not a child, like a young infant, that sort of doesn't know what the hell's going on, doesn't understand reality at all, it's like literally, it can't even see more than 1 foot in front of its face or 2 feet in front of its face. That, I mean, children at the start, they only know the difference between anger and sort of not having anger. It's sort of, I mean, in some sense, they just have different degrees of being tired. Their default is happy, and when they're not happy or tired, they're angry. it's I mean, I guess you could say that when you've got such structured beliefs and things like that, that you're not interested in having them emulate emotions, because then it's harder to maintain the rigidity and concreteness of those structures. But I mean, yeah, I guess essentially you have to concede in some meta belief that already you're okay with inventing some kind of contemplative device or some kind of further side of the mind or process in the mind that is actually instructive and directive over intervening and orchestrating the sets of belief, or regulating the sets of belief. Okay, I'm just going to stop this recording now because there's too much background noise. This is hopefully going to be a quick addendum. I just want to neaten up one of the descriptions that I was making about borderline. So when I say that essentially they have a kind of a pseudo meta ego or something like that, and then I think I could have much better described the functioning, how they orchestrate their personality disorder. Essentially, is that they see their subconscious as a kind of atmospheric cloud which they are imposing on other people and other scenarios, and that they are using to fill up the context and sort of cloud out any other context. And if there's a disruptive context to their imposition of their cloud atmospheric condition of their subconscious that they're trying to project and transpose onto other people, then they sort of use elements from the unconscious bank to sort of barrage them with, and to disorientate them, and to use attrition against them to wear them down and to make them relent. And so there's this often, there are complaints about not being able to understand, not being able to follow, having a very sort of short attention span that's all over the place. It's sort of it's just this almost like a social expectation terrorism or something like the terrorism of social conventions and rules, and sort of whatever excuse might work, and they just keep on throwing things at people until they work to get the consequence. But anyway, the actual consequence of this, really, of infecting people with this atmospheric cloud of their subconscious emotional sort of vampirism, or this collective emotional sort of unit that gets created in a kind of codependent sort of amalgamate, is so that they can perpetrate this meta ego, because they don't want to do the ego function themselves and regulate their own subconscious emotional state, which is being generated from all these conflicting, inconsistent, unconscious beliefs, which they don't want to order, they don't want to touch it, they just want it to be served. And so they are doing this in a way to sort of completely maintain everything in their unconscious mind. They don't want, they just want it to be served. And so they've got this, in some sense, they have preemptively what's the word? They are anticipating other egos doing this work, and they essentially just want to engineer. They have the reason why I call them as having a meta ego is because their whole disposition, this whole array of circumstance, and this whole tactical use of communication and linguistic voicing of the narrative condition, is so they can be the kind of, they are trying to speak directly like a radio voice, like a voice inside your head. They are trying to narrate the voice, to be the voice inside your thoughts, to be your voice of their, so that they are the voice of your thinking. And so then you are forced to feel what that might suggest, and to try to organize that in terms of belief so that they can hear what your reactive belief response is to it. So essentially, they are the meta ego in that they are the taskmaster of other people's egos, which they are trying to get to run and emulate their subconscious. That they are trying to create the social condition in which it has already been accepted that they get to essentially be your thinking, the voice of your own thinking. So they are imposing. So it's weird because when they speak, they are actually speaking in a meta ego language, in that they are trying to substitute your own thinking, so that you aren't even there to have your own ego, you're there to have their ego for them. You are there to substitute their ego, and they are speaking in the voice of this meta ego, which is the taskmaster of your ego. So they have a very sophisticated mechanism here, where they have everything lined up to be the voice of this meta ego, just so that they can avoid doing that function themselves, having their own ego function. And that's why I think that there's a very, the whole thing is so sophisticated that it essentially runs on bad faith. It runs on this dependence and addiction to being in this transactional mode of never doing anything if there isn't an immediate descriptive power that and mass which is being acquired. It's just constant acquisition of unconscious resources that then can be passed on to some new person that will be the ego that will take tasks from the meta ego. So it doesn't matter what happens, because it will always just become fuel for the next ego that will do the work of from the voice of this meta ego. So it's easy for it to do whatever it wants to do, because it's never generous. It can never be giving, because it doesn't regulate itself. It's all just passed on to the future ego that will end up burdening the responsibility and doing the work of the actual accountability of ordering the unconscious. And essentially, because it's so addicted to outsourcing that function, it can just continue to live in this continual sequence of I mean, the only way I can sort of describe it is that it's like, I mean, in terms of how it appears, it's as if you're dealing with someone who's just consistently drunk on their own emotional state. But the actual like meta ego subtext of the emotional chaos is essentially just this immediate greed of always only doing something because of the immediate gratification, the immediate motivation to access more power, to leverage more compulsive control over the environmental sort of inception that this condition, that this cloud is just sort of, so it just takes over the context. It just automatically directs the context. It automatically narrates this objective reality. There's no respect for anyone's independent reality, and there's no developed maturity in order to participate as an equal among equals with other participants that have to negotiate and persuade and compromise each other. That just doesn't exist, because it's only the voice of the meta ego, which is talking from this third person perspective and describes their own feeling state and their own bundle of expectations and beliefs, and which are never put into an alignment, which are never comprehensively laid out to promote a kind of consistent self-regulation or ownership of curating that bundle of expectations. It's always just accumulating this bundle. It's just always just as a descriptive mass. It can just always be used on the next vessel of codependent ego function that works at the behest of the voice of their meta ego, or the tone that they use. And all this tone is just it's a pattern of behavior. It's a habitual thing. You just stop the behavior and you do something else. Well, you stop the behavior and you contemplatively restructure your internal system according to the concept of self-ownership and self-regulation. And you recode your memories, and instead of seeing it as a description of a condition which you possess, that you just possess all these different factors and all these different conditions that happen to you passively, that you recode those memories as that you actively cause the things around you through the lack of your filter, through the lack of your actuation of self-regulation and self-curatorship. Because of your failure to curate and to communicate a coherent position, a clearly an open and direct motivation, because your motivation is just always this mirage of just convoluted. It's just like a chimera. It just shows a different face. It just, like, as soon as you run into a problem that seems like other people aren't going to do it for you, then you just come up with a new demand. You just come up with a new pretext. You just put a new veil on it. You just redisguise it, and you just sort of novate it slightly, and then you retroactively say that was always what you were interested in, and other people were stupid for not already interpreting that that's what you needed and that's what you deserved to happen. So it's just this sort of this ongoing sense of never-ending and eternally deep entitlement that just sort of gets somebody else to burden the aftermath of the incoherence and the inconsistency, because there's no responsibility to generate that coherence. And in fact, if you wanted to try and make them generate that coherence, I mean, you can't, but you would have to deliver a motivation for them to do that, and that motivation would be in the form of a descriptive mass which they would only want if it could be used to compel other people to continue to do this work for them. Because that's essentially all they want, and that's why essentially the only resolve and determination they have is the determination to possess other people that are capable of doing this ego function for them, as they are the taskmaster of dispensing those tasks from their meta ego sort of functional construct. I've been mainly thinking about borderline, so I mean I haven't given the same depth of thinking to narcissism. Narcissism it's more simple than this. I mean the narcissist is also doing other things, but you see, like, the borderline essentially already has a foot into the ego and a foot into the subconscious. So to me, I do think that if they can just clean up their bad faith, they realize that essentially, well, will they decide to generate self-motivation? Will they decide, and I mean, they probably, well, I mean, it's a personal issue, it's a personal question. They have to do it for because they want to, because they choose to. It's like, it's weird when you're not a self-motivated person, when you have an external locus of see, I don't even think of them as having an external locus of control. I think that they have an internal locus of control. I just think that they think that they can get away with disguising that fact. They think that they can sort of get away with that bad faith, that they can use moral codes and social conventions to disguise what they're doing, and that is what they do. And if anyone gets close to the truth, then they just kind of barrage them with distractions, and they derail the conversation, and they change the subject, and they invent some kind of drama, or they invent some kind of excuse, and they say, "Oh, you're attacking me," or they just they do everything to continue the self delusion, as it were. Which is funny, because the more that they can find people to pander to it, like the sort of fundamentally the worse it gets, because it doesn't even maintain its own, as I described before, like it doesn't even maintain its own attachment mechanism when it actually finds a codependent vessel to host its ego function. So it's like it's I mean, the analogy would be like a parasite that kills its host, or that is fundamentally that ends up forcing the host to reject it, because it actually needs that feedback, it needs that resistance. Like, borderline is different. Like, narcissism, I think, might also be fundamentally toxic in many ways, but I think borderline narcissism might have the capability of having a consistent treatment, whereas borderlines fundamentally spiral, because they have to experience resistance, because it's the only way that they can contact reality is by experiencing resistance with their host. Because if they don't get resistance, they never get any fundamental revision of their unconscious belief structure. And so they in the same way that narcissistic supply is needed by a narcissist to keep their unconscious mind labeled as a single identity, as a single entity, which would generally be also the function that the ego does, because the ego says, this is what I have done, therefore this is the definition that conforms with the meta belief of a self-identity. The narcissist doesn't have an ego, so it needs the narcissistic supply, it needs the attention in order to keep that whatever belief structure in the unconscious mind that the narcissist is locates as the locus, nexus of self, or whatever, that you can call that the false self. I mean, I would just call it the unconscious component of the self, or of the mind, or something like that, or the unconscious side of the mind, as it relates to self, belief in as a self. I didn't want to say belief in the self, but anyway. So what was I saying? I was saying this because I wanted to contrast it with borderline. Whereas the borderline is essentially using something that is akin to narcissistic supply. They need attention and things like that, and but their mechanism is more sophisticated, because their meta ego is not a substitute for an ego function. Because so I'm just trying to get these words technically correct. So I'm saying that, like, a narcissist doesn't ever get an ego function, and the narcissistic supply is having some semblance of what an ego would perform, but it's something completely alien almost to the ordinary structuring of the mind. The borderline is much closer to replicating an ordinary false ego complex, The borderline case is just creating a very elaborate, sophisticated, ulterior method of actuating the false ego. So, they've got some kind of belief in their unconscious mind where their subconscious is both projected onto other people and shared by other people, and like they are, like, it's like a fundamental sort of codependent sort of strategy. So they've got like a codependent strategy built into their unconscious belief structure, and then they end up having, instead of having a regular ego, they have a meta ego, because then that is the kind of placeholder where other people's egos will slot in to their collective subconscious. So they've got this sort of outsourced subconscious that is related to a kind of a concept or a notion of a meta ego. And I still think that this meta ego is fundamentally sort of, it's hard to say where it's located. I don't know if it's located in the subconscious or in the unconscious. It's a bit of both, probably. That it has some of its algorithmic characteristics generated by some elements that is a kind of meta belief in the unconscious mind, and that is a kind of so it's a strategy that is forged in the unconscious, that is forged in a set of beliefs about your own habits or something like that. But the problem is that anything in the unconscious mind, anything that is just a belief, it will produce an emotional imprint of itself. It will impress emotions into your emotional state. But it can only do that in terms of what you have done, which requires some kind of ego function, which the narcissist is outsourcing, in the sense that they need to get other people's attention. They need the attention of other egos, so that they can know that their unconscious mind is not fundamentally inert or dead or something like that. That it's relevant in some way. It's relevant to the world. It has a kind of emotional impact on something or something. It has an impression. So, in some sense, I think the narcissist knows that they need a subconscious. Yeah, I think the narcissist is better described is that they know, because they are an unconscious mind effectively, they know that they need a subconscious to validate their unconsciousness. And because they don't have their own emotions, they need other people, they need to triangulate what their emotional state sort of would be, in conjunction with a kind of a set of external stimuli or whatever, reaction, or so the attention that they get from other people's egos is sort of like leads them to believe that they have a subconscious, or it simulates their own subconscious to such a degree that it can placate their unconscious as not being a kind of a failure or something like that, a kind of so the problem is, I guess, the problem with the narcissist and the necessity of the narcissist to have narcissistic supply is that they don't want to merely be relegated as a totem. They don't want to become a kind of inanimate object, which they are at risk of becoming an inanimate object unless someone gives them attention, so that they can sort of simulate in the reflection of that attention what their subconscious, they can see in the form of attention and emotional reactions they get from other people. They can triangulate through the eyes and the egos of other people what their emotional state would virtually amount to. So they can sort of triangulate what the subtext of their beliefs are. So they're kind of using the environmental surroundings to map an emotional state of themselves, um, or to model an emotional state of themselves, like not map what is actually emotionally there, but to reflectively to bask in the refracted energy of other people's egos and emotions, to work out where to somehow plot themselves. So they really are having this whole virtual false ego sort of that they're trying to emulate. Whereas the borderline is sort of more authentically replicating a functional ego. They're just doing it through very sophisticated ulterior pathways and convoluted manners. You know, it's a very I mean, it's weird in that the narcissist almost presupposes that people have different realities. It needs that fact that everyone is an island unto themselves, whereas the borderline is the exact opposite. The borderline believes that they are the only island. They are the only landmass. They are the only context. Well, I mean, sorry, when I say believes, I mean that's how they function. I don't think that they actually believe that. I think they know that that's not how it works, but they are just like, well, I can get away with it. I can, through my behavior, I can force people to treat me in a compliant way with what I'm projecting. So they kind of, that introjective reality that narcissists have, the borderline is much more, what's the word, almost intuitive at being able to manipulate. It's weird because, I mean, it often, it's so fake, it seems, how to say this, because, they can fool some people very well, but obviously no one can tolerate them for that long, because it becomes too taxing because of the fundamental incoherence and therefore the irresponsibility that other people end up having to burden and be and other, it becomes costed onto other people. It gets blamed on other people. Because they just always just generate new entitlement, new expectations, and they what am I saying? Yeah, I'm too tired to make these recordings. There was another note that I wanted to add to clarify. I had described this better in a prior recording when I was talking about what was it now? Was it the function of the ego? I've had a better description of something that I described. I don't know. I have to try and fucking remember. It's to do with what did I describe badly? The function of the ego. Which I call sometimes metacognition. Oh, the having done. Yeah, okay, yeah, so the ego, when I described like what that you have to have done something, and I was trying to distinguish that, or to delineate it distinctly from the kind of similar data which is held as a belief in the unconscious mind. So what you believe that you have done and what you have done in a metacognitive way is like the difference between what you have done in a teleological consideration. So if you reflect in a metacognitive way about what you have done, it essentially it's in order to have a purpose, in order to survey and pervade your sense of purpose about what you have done. So the purpose about what you have done is what the ego is overseeing, whereas your belief about what you have done is just, it's contextualized by your other beliefs, and those beliefs together are going to consolidate into an emotional state or into an emotional picture or something like that, which is going to be held and portrayed by the subconscious, or monitored by the subconscious, or monitored in the subconscious, as an experience of feelings. So yeah, I just wanted to try and draw that out, that the distinction between the ego and the anger that the subconscious feels until you actually have a goal, a purpose, a teleos, a vision, an overarching vision that contextualizes all the emotions. You see, you can't really have nuanced emotions until you have an overarching overseer function in the mind that has a kind of a goal in mind, and then it has a sort of, everything is a component part of that goal, relative to that goal, relative to that unifying function. And so being drunk on the anger produced in the subconscious, as the kings and the rich merchants of the subconscious that are drunk with the fornication with the whore of Babylon, the unconscious mind, that archetypal description is essentially the subjugation of the subconscious to the unconscious, and therefore you never get an ordering of anything. You don't get coherence and consistency. You end up just sort of sorry, let me just focus on the anger. So the anger never has an action which can execute the anger, that can exhaust it, that can expend it, that can resolve it. And so instead it's sort of, the resolve is to be just drunk on the anger, to just sort of acclimatize yourself to that anger, to that persistent anger. Which I do think that is perhaps an ongoing theme that both narcissists and borderlines are experiencing because of their irregular displacement or substitution of the ego function. Which the narcissist can only get glimmers of, trying to regulate their emotions by virtually triangulating what their subconscious would be modeled as relative to other people's more developed ego functions, trying to study it and from how they exhibit those ego functions from the outside, but also exploiting the weaknesses that they have, because essentially, relative to the narcissist, a normal person, let's just say, or an ordinary false ego complex, has more parts to it, whereas the narcissist is just the unconscious mind. So the narcissist is relative to the ordinary person, is a fortress, is a single entity, whereas other people are a set of coordinated parts. And so it's much easier to sort of infiltrate and to manipulate by essentially trying to confuse how those parts might interrelate, and to sort of to impede and to get in between those parts, and to create roles for yourself being a necessary I'm too tired to get into this. I mean, this is slight conjecture on some part, but it's just essentially how a narcissist might see themselves as being more potent and being more than other people, or something like that, than an average, ordinary false ego complex. I mean, obviously, it's much harder to manipulate other people that are tremendously self-aware. Like, I would consider myself to be tremendously self-aware, but I mean, that's because I'm a private researcher in modeling personality theory and such. But anyway, it's not such an important topic. So I just wanted to add that the ego function, linking it to the concept of what have you done, I mean that in a teleological outline framework, that is the reflective facility that the ego function performs. And it performs it primarily over the subconscious, which is itself a kind of representation of everything in the unconscious mind. So the ego can indirectly get its hands on the contents of the unconscious mind via the subconscious, which is actually perfectly healthy to do. I mean, there's nothing wrong with only using your ego and your subconscious in that way, because then effectively it's reflective of the unconscious. The unconscious is fully represented. And essentially, as long as your ego is mature and faithful and properly developed, and is not using certain strategies in how it coordinates with the subconscious to try and create an immediate short-term thing, which is essentially, all of those are somewhat symbolic representations of the subconscious actually creating a fissure in itself that is representative of a kind of cognitive dissonance of the unconscious belief structure. So it's just sort of like, it's kind of like doing shoddy construction work, but then just sort of painting over it or plastering over it, so it's just sort of like, as long as the ego is a faithful worker when it's constructing things in relation to the subconscious, it never has to worry about, sort of things suddenly falling apart and the whole thing disintegrating and crumbling. Which is effectively analogously what the borderline personality disordered person is addicted to doing. They're addicted to just doing the fast, expedient, convenient, immediate gratification sort of thing, and then just meta-tasking somebody else's ego to just sort of deal with the whole bundle of whatever the resulting accumulated thing that happens, just passing it on to some next person. or just adding it to the descriptive narrative, which is always capable of having enough confabulation and amnesia and selective memory and cherry-picked factors of what to report, and the right amount of distraction and linguistic manipulation and social conventions to communicate in such a way so as to create a pretty enough pretext, a good enough pretense that will fool the next person to getting into a kind of codependent relationship to their meta ego taskmaster, so it's just trying to find a stable thing that will burden that externalized blame and accountability that isn't being orchestrated internally, which essentially they're just not interested in developing. Which again, I do think it's I mean, I guess there can be some level of self-delusion, but about this point itself, that they're not responsible for continually recreating this. But you see, it's somewhat paradoxical. Like if you're hearing this and you are borderline, and you're sort of thinking about this for the first time, for all these things, from all these things being told to you in one package or something like that, it doesn't matter if, oh well, obviously I would change if I knew this, and I would like to change now that I've heard this, or something like that. There's no point in describing yourself as being worse off for not having heard it sooner or something like that, and creating another descriptive condition that you are merely in the possession of it, and therefore as you are in the possession of it, of these features and conditions and factors, you don't have self-ownership. You have to retroactively make yourself responsible for not imposing self-regulation on yourself. That is the thing that creates the facility in the first place. So that blame is the room in your mind that becomes the self-regulated emotional state, and via the emotional state, the unconscious sets of belief, and ordering those sets of belief. Again, let me just say that, like, all emotions stem from beliefs. There is not an emotion that exists that isn't sourced in a belief. Every emotion has a reason for existing, and that reason is a belief. You cannot have an emotion that isn't linked to a belief. You might not know what that belief is. That belief might be a whole set of beliefs that you're not used to discerning between and locating between certain combinations of beliefs that are invoked in you, or something like that, that you can, but that comes from a kind of internal emotional intelligence that only happens when you grapple with your emotions. What's my point of saying that? So I mean, in the ideal situation, it's actually a very effective way to conduct one's a psyche, because then your beliefs tell you instantly information about. So if you have a comprehensive set of beliefs, then you know exactly in what way, based on your feeling, you know exactly what kind of precarious situation you might be in, because you know exactly which beliefs are being impinged on by some set of events. And sometimes you can be impinged on by complicated set of events, or sometimes a simple set of events, so you know exactly what beliefs are being triggered, as it were. And if it's convoluted, sometimes you might have to think very carefully about in what beliefs you prioritize, and what combination and configuration of beliefs you ameliorate first before moving. You might triage some beliefs and attend to some beliefs and craft your behavior in order to prioritize some beliefs first because maybe it's an emergency or something like that, and then attend to the other ones later because you know which ones will be able to be fixed in time and which ones need immediate palliative address. You know, there's a kind of, you know, there's a science of convalescence, as it were, in terms of your beliefs via your emotions. But, you know, the emotions, if you have enough experience and built up emotional intelligence and some experience with your beliefs as well, you can get to such, I mean, obviously there's an infinite array of complexity which might, you know, which you might be posed by, but generally speaking, one can increase one's ability in order to self-diagnose, as it were, which beliefs are being and then you might also work out how to revise your beliefs or to collate your beliefs or to structure your beliefs into different sets or into a different comprehensive matrix in order to better facilitate triage and adaptation and updating and revision. And you might get very good at working out which beliefs are actually chronically lead to more beliefs or more problems or something like that. You know, so you know you can somewhat create a more integrated sort of system that is more holistically sort of attuned. But you know that happens sort of in time to some degree. After you've got the rudiments, you know, sort of crafted. I just thought I'd mention this sort of stuff. Yeah, I'm still recovering, so I don't have the energy to comprehensively go into this stuff. Another note that I just want to quickly add is that what is it? Oh yeah, I mean this kind of, you can, if you sort of review everything that I said, you can sort of summarize a point that goes something like this: that the borderline it's like the borderline is operating something like a meta ego, and the narcissist is operating like a meta subconscious. So it's like a pretext that hangs above a placeholder that a subconscious would feel has to be virtually sort of triangulated and plotted. So the borderline is doing that in terms of the ego, and therefore they are subversively projecting and transposing a kind of a subconscious atmosphere that they are injecting onto people, that they are transposing onto people. Whereas the narcissist is transposing unconsciousness, elements of the unconscious mind, beliefs onto people. They're transposing beliefs onto people in order to have a meta subconscious that they are virtually plotting and trying to induce or experiment onto people, or to create, you know, so they're sort of, they're bombarding people with the so the narcissist is like transposing unconscious mind elements or beliefs. They are trying to transpose unconscious belief structures onto people and make people take on certain unconscious belief structures. Now the narcissist is then slightly fundamentally different from the borderline, although all of these things are operating out from, or orchestrated as from their source, from the unconscious mind. which is the source of essentially setting up these sophisticated pretexts of having these meta egos or meta subconscious minds, sides of the mind. What was this point that I wanted to make now? But the narcissist is like technically quite distinct, because the narcissist is transposing things. Well, actually, maybe the borderline is also doing the same. I mean, the difference that I was trying to make is that if the source of all of this is the unconscious mind, then the narcissist is distinct from the borderline, because the narcissist is transposing things onto other people, is sharing things with other people that are similar to the narcissist's seat of consciousness. So they know that they are being duplicitous in a very direct way. They know that essentially they are acting one way and structuring their unconscious mind one way, and they want you to take on unconscious belief structures that are complicit to them in their unconscious belief structure. So it's like it's an asymmetrical relationship. Whereas the borderline, the pretext of the borderline is much more duplicitous, because the pretense, the mirage that they create with the lure, the subconscious atmosphere that they are incepting other people to accept, is something that their emotional body, their subconscious themselves can sort of believe the truth of that, but that is like a subtextual layer that is sort of supposedly happening from the basis of the unconscious mind. But the unconscious mind, in some sense, is fundamentally fractured or split into, let's say, an internal fidelity of a kind of autistic solipsism, and a secondary virtual structure which is constantly being assembled in order for it to be channeled into developing the mirage, the subconscious pretense. So, and that is a structure which is fundamentally fluid. It gives the borderline its chaotic inconsistency, incoherence. You know, the kind of because it's sort of that thing is having the reset button pushed on it every time it reaches an impasse. It just sort of collapses and then gets sort of rebuilt. But there are other structures in the unconscious mind which are facilitating that algorithmic process of that re-encapsulation of the new mirage of because the mirage is not merely, the mirage itself is quite brittle, because it gets reborn every now and again, every time it's convenient to do so. But you know, these new identities are being created multiple times a day, potentially. They're being modified and adapted and revised and being reset. And that, in some sense, there's a meta ego that attaches to that, in that it has these meta questions which have to be answered, which they are getting other people to ask, because of the interface that the structure has in terms of its emotional imprint and expression in terms of the subconscious, which is effectively bled out into the environment. It's shared in the it's projected onto the environment. The environment is said to cause it directly, so that they can outsource the meta question of the ego function in relation to that. So it's like it's a fundamentally codependent subconscious. So the unconscious mind of the borderline is fundamentally generating these mirages which are algorithmically amount to maintaining this fundamentally codependent subconscious. Now you see, that is somewhat more sophisticated than the narcissist. The narcissist very clearly knows that, like, there's a rule for me, there's a structure for me, and then there's a structure that I want you to do. It's a very asymmetrical sort of thing. Whereas there's also asymmetry in the borderline, but it's much more convoluted and sophisticated, because it's a chain of internal propitiation, or there's an internal mechanism that is facilitating an external abeyance, or an external behavior, an anticipated external reaction that then validates, let's say, the rationale of this mechanism, of the algorithm. And even the rationale of that algorithm is a kind of emotional logic, or a deeper sort of meta subtext or whatever, that so I mean, you can sort of imagine some of the sort of, the poorer people who have relationships with this, and then it's like you can sort of imagine the stereotypical, they call them wife beaters, with wearing their wife beater T-shirts or whatever, and then he physically abuses his wife, and then he reports that no, she wants me to hit her, she is, and there is some truth to this, because if she doesn't have a descriptive mass, am I really going to go into the mechanics of this? Okay, I'm not going to go into the mechanics of this, it's too excruciating, but I'm just going to summarize it and say this, that essentially, because these algorithmic mechanics have a fundamental asymmetry in terms of how they are anticipating an external reaction that is going to feed this internal mechanism or whatever. Essentially, the mechanism itself, in aggregate, can be seen as a form of debtorship. That is how it masks itself. That's how it conveys itself externally in the codependency. It extracts sympathy, an ongoing one-way sympathy or whatever. And the only way that it can ensure that sympathy and secure it is by sort of solidifying a kind of a drama, which usually is some kind of like abusive relationship to some degree, because then she can be secure that if he actually left her, then he would have to worry that she might get someone else to like go and do hurt to him because of his past dealings with her, that she has this descriptive mass as a resource that she can count on and essentially use over him to plot him and to confine him into the role. So it's a drama, a physical drama that is solidified with a certain combination of social expectation, rules, external factors that can be leveraged, sort of implicit fear and suggestion. So the victim, the ostensible victim, can actually use her victimhood as a way to generate reliability and dependability on whatever codependent psychic function is being done. So it's kind of like a quid pro quo sort of trade to some degree. I would have to neaten that up to some degree, but I don't want to. Let me see what else to say about this. So the borderline really wants to describe themselves as having conditions that pertain to them, that they possess, that were foisted onto them to some degree, that they are that were irresistibly imposed against them, and so therefore they can deserve consolation, and they can leverage that descriptive mass to obtain consolation in the form of somebody else's ego function or whatever. But okay, anyway. So anyway, now the asymmetry that I was originally talking about, which then I kind of convoluted myself slightly, but is that when a narcissist is transposing and projecting, they are projecting onto other people's unconscious minds, so that they can sort of garner some meta subconscious sustenance. And there's a kind of parity there, where the narcissist, what the narcissist is doing is very simple. They are an unconscious mind, and they see the state of other people's unconscious minds, and then that's what they're fucking with, essentially. They're fucking with other people's belief structures. A borderline has got this segmented unconscious mind where they're sort of doing two things simultaneously, and the one thing they don't reveal to other people, but essentially they've got this Machiavellian meta structure in their unconscious, and then they've got this sort of pansy sort of valence algorithmic sort of formula which can create mirages which the subconscious can channel. And that's their lure. That subconscious mirage is just a facade in order to facilitate a meta ego, which again is sort of sourced in the unconscious mind, and which is in order to contrast their unconscious source of these things against what they can plot according to their unconscious belief structure, and anticipate according to their unconscious belief structure what they believe that they are able to predict, and they just like seeing other people do ego function. They like seeing other people do ego function for them in relation to their issues, in relation to their unconscious beliefs, through the medium of sharing and jointly being co-burdened by their stream of mirages and subconscious signaling, which is how essentially which is the medium through which the Machiavellian unconscious metastructure is able to anticipate and plot. So, and you can talk to this thing. You can really, it's there in the borderline. It doesn't matter how crazy and chaotic they are. It doesn't matter how much they're crying and talking about that they're about to go to suicide. They are one breath away from talking in that Machiavellian unconscious metastructure. If they know that someone isn't letting them get away with it, they will talk it. The only thing holding them back is that if they reveal it, then they are showing their hand. That's the only difference, is that if they think that they can, if there are still more cards in the deck of the algorithmic thing, then they will just continue playing that game because it's not exhausted yet. They have to have an impetus to actually reveal their internal meta structure that's orchestrating this. But this is why I say the whole thing is based on bad faith. The whole thing really is just it's a facade. It's a very elaborate, it's such a facade that they end up emotionally paying for, but they do it all because they're incapable of just the thought of doing their own ego function. Is just, life isn't worth living if they have to do their own ego function. They are just so unmotivated. They want their ego function to continue to be this meta vacant field that gets populated by somebody else's work. They want to see other people. They want to be the taskmaster of somebody else fulfilling their ego function. That is their only wish in life. So it's somewhat of a sort of a controlling game. It really is a game that is just completely obsessed with control. They will destroy their own lives just to continue to exhibit control in terms of what's the other thing here? I was going to get to... Okay, so yeah, the asymmetry is that the narcissist is dealing from their unconscious to other people's unconsciousnesses in order to kind of have a meta subconscious. Essentially by getting, in some sense, they want the milk, but they don't want to farm. They don't want to keep a herd of cows. They don't want to feed the cows. So it's like other people have a subconscious because of their ego function. But the narcissist is just not interested in the ego function at all. They just want the fruit of the ego function, which is the subconscious. So they are trying to sort of, in some sense, they're outsourcing the ego function, but they're not interested in how it's made. They just want the finished product, essentially. And so, like, although subtextually in the picture, other people are performing the ego function for the narcissist, the narcissist is essentially only doing it for to plot what a virtual subconscious would look like, so that they can work out how good their standing of their subconscious, their unconscious structures are. They can work out what their standing, the relative standing of their unconscious structures through the virtual sort of correlation that it has to a subconscious sort of model. In the same way, the borderline has an ego model, in the same way that they're trying to map out an ego model, and therefore it's sort of, you see, the fundamental difference with the fundamental problem with the borderline is because of this more sophisticated structure, that the data held by the unconscious mind, that is how it should be conceived of, is just, it's data, it's just information in its raw form. Because of how the borderline functions, the data essentially is transmuted into a kind of lore. And it's governed by the mythology of this virtual ego. And so, which then has this kind of, I mean, talking about the internal symmetries and asymmetries and things like that are useful on some conceptual level, just to understand the kinds of imbalances and the kinds of inconsistency that is generated internally, the kind of dissonance that happens, because those descriptions, although they're quite technical, you'll be able to map some of their behavior, and some of the features of their behaviors and tactics and things like that will become more apparent, and why those mechanics, why the tactics which they use are fundamentally unsustainable, why they degrade by themselves if left unresisted. They actually need a kind of a perfect kind of codependency that is resistant enough just to sort of hope. Well, I mean, I don't think it's ever actually sustainable, because it will always actually up the chaos. It will actually unsettle things. It will automatically because they want to resolve a final circumstance where they are in debtorship, because then they can count on some kind of transactional thing, and they want the security of that. So this is the sort of their end game. It's a sort of allergic to the threat of independence, and because it's fundamentally allergic to the threat of independence and independent self-regulation and self-ownership, it will fundamentally try to make any advent of independence impossible. It will sort of burn every bridge it can. It will even go through huge Machiavellian processes in order to make themselves helplessly prone to the conditions which they can describe as a descriptive mass, so that then they can be in a position to depend on somebody else, having to pander to whatever reports that they have, that they can never be responsible themselves for administering. So the borderline really has a goal. It has a teleos, which is to be allergic to goals and purposes that are self-orchestrated. They just have the ingredients of goals. They have a bundle of desires and expectations, and they use that descriptive mass to just generate more mirages, to try to create the right kind of seduction and lure in order to find the right kind of host that can provide the codependency needed to sort of to continue this. So essentially, it just doesn't want to change. And it usually can always find the excuse and the resources to avoid developing the motivation. And because it can just say, oh, well, I am motivated, I just can't now. Why? It's just, and then, it's stuck if it has to actually try to reason itself consistently. It's much better if it can just sort of distract or derail or find some cheap and easy way to get back to some kind of convenient self-deluding, sort of description. I mean, there's no substitute for just behaving independently, living independently, generating some kind of independent experience or something like that. Practicing the self-regulation, developing a comprehensive restructuring of how you filter and curate your own beliefs and manage and coalesce your own goals and purposes and sort of form your direction, which then you are responsible for orchestrating or planning, that you're not sort of always just outsourcing. I guess there's a legal sort of qualification or technical difference between advice and information. But I mean, I think even if you ask for advice, you have to see that you're only receiving information. When they ask for advice, or even when they tend to just be asking for information, they are extracting advice and they are expecting a kind of duty and obligation that is implicit in that device, that you are the guarantor of anything, of any communication, which is why they are so obsessed with kind of linguistic tricks of speaking in a certain tense or in a certain grammatical syntax that. Oh, I mean, there's so many different levels of dishonesty that they engage with. Anyway, I'm not going to get into this. I'm too tired.